Report 1. It was in a small town in the interior of the United States where my cousin Megan and I decided to spend a weekend in a cabin in the woods. The place seemed perfect to disconnect from the hustle and bustle. No cell phone signal, surrounded by tall trees and the sound of streams. But on the first night, something happened that completely changed my view of that forest. The cabin was simple, with only 2 bedrooms, a small living room, and a porch that overlooked a winding trail. We arrived in the late afternoon, with the sun setting behind the mountains. The tranquility was almost unreal. Megan loved adventures, so she suggested we explore the trail the next day. I agreed, despite feeling a bit uncomfortable with the idea of venturing so far. That night, we sat on the porch to enjoy the fresh air. The forest around us felt alive, with the sounds of crickets, owls, and the occasional snap of branches. But around 11 p.m., everything went silent. Completely. It was as if the forest had stopped breathing. It was Megan who first commented, "Did you notice how it got strange?" I just nodded, trying to ignore the chill running down my spine. The next morning we began our hike. The woods were dense, with trees so tall that they blocked much of the sunlight. Megan led the way, pointing out animals and interesting details, but I felt something was wrong. It was as if we were being watched. At one point, I noticed there were unusual marks on the trees, deep scratches too high to have been made by normal animals. "Do you think a bear did this?" I asked. Megan stopped, looked at the marks, and shook her head. It looked strange, like it was something intentional. We decided to continue, but my unease only grew. The trail seemed longer than expected, and soon we realized we were lost. It was then that we heard it. Footsteps, not ours. Something heavy, moving slowly but steadily a few meters behind us. We stopped walking, and the footsteps stopped too. Megan looked at me, pale. "We're not alone," I whispered back. "Keep walking, don't look back." We quickened our pace, trying to find our way back, but the footsteps followed us. The sound was more intense now, as if whoever it was getting closer. At one point, Megan stumbled, and when I looked to help her, I saw something between the trees. A tall, lean silhouette with glowing eyes. It was impossible to tell what it was, but it seemed human and at the same time not. "Run!" I shouted, pulling Megan. We ran like never before, hearing the footsteps almost beside us, matching our movements. The forest seemed endless until we finally spotted the cabin. We rushed inside and locked the door, panting. Absolute silence again. When I looked out the window, I saw the silhouette standing at the edge of the trail, motionless, as if it were watching us. Megan turned on the generator, and the porch light came on. But when we looked again, there was nothing there. We spent the night awake, listening for any sound from outside. But everything became strangely calm. The next day, we decided to leave, leaving the woods behind. To this day, we don't know what we saw in that forest. Megan never wanted to talk about it again, and I avoid isolated cabins at all costs. But sometimes, in my dreams, I still see those eyes glowing in the darkness. And I wonder, what else was watching us that night? Report 2. I have always enjoyed running outdoors, especially in quiet places, away from the chaos of the city. That day, I was in a forest about a 30-minute drive from my home. I had been there a few times before, but had always stuck to the main trails. However, that morning, I decided to explore a less traveled route. It was a mistake I should never have made. It was a cool and calm morning, with the sky still overcast. The forest seemed peaceful, with the gentle sound of birds and the wind rustling through the trees. I started my run as usual, adjusting my pace and enjoying the tranquility. After a few minutes, I came across a fork in the trail. One of the paths seemed to lead into a more overgrown area, and without thinking too much, I decided to follow it. The trail was deserted narrower. The trees around me seemed to grow closer together, blocking out the sunlight. Before long, I realized I had lost GPS signal on my phone. I kept running, thinking the trail would eventually connect back to the main one, but every turn seemed to take me deeper into the forest. When I stopped to rest, I noticed the silence. It wasn't the relaxing kind of silence, but something heavy, as if the forest was holding its breath. I looked around and didn't recognize anything. The trees all looked the same, and the path I had come from seemed to have vanished. I started walking, trying to retrace my steps, but the more I tried, the more lost I felt. The sun began to set, and darkness came quickly. I tried using my phone's flashlight, but the battery was almost dead. That's when I heard the first sounds. Footsteps, light and rhythmic, matching the pattern of my quickening breath. I called out, "Is anyone there?" Nothing, just the echo of my voice. I kept walking, trying to ignore the growing fear, but the footsteps followed me, now faster. It was as if something was trying to get closer, but always hiding in the shadows. I decided I needed to find a place to spend the night. I found a small clearing and sat down against a tree. It was completely dark, and the only light came from the dim screen of my phone. With every sound, I froze, trying to decipher whether it was just the wind or something more. Then I saw it, something among the trees, a tall, thin figure standing still and motionless. I could barely make out its shape, but I knew it was watching me. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. When I opened them again, it had moved closer. I was paralyzed, unable to run or scream. The figure seemed to have no face, just a dense, pulsating shadow. I heard a whispered sound, like a mix of distorted voices, but I couldn't understand the words. I grabbed a nearby stick and threw it in its direction, but it simply vanished into the darkness. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, praying for the sun to rise soon. When the first light of day finally appeared, I realized that the clearing where I was did not look at all like the place I had stopped the night before. The trees were different, and the main trail was only a few meters away from me. I arrived home exhausted and in shock, but nobody believed my story. They said I was just scared from getting lost. But even today, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that whisper. Something was in that forest with me, and I'm sure that if I hadn't managed to escape, I would have never been found. Relato 3. I always thought that nature was the best refuge to clear the mind. But after what I experienced that night, I never set foot in a forest again. It was an ordinary weekend when I decided to camp alone to clear my thoughts. I thought it would be an experience of peace and reconnection. I was completely wrong. I chose a forest far from the city, known for its secluded trails and natural beauty. I took with me a small tent, enough food for 2 days, and my cell phone, although the signal there was almost non-existent. The plan was simple: a leisurely hike during the day and a night under the stars. The place was exactly as I imagined, with dense trees, the constant sound of birds, and the gentle wind rustling the leaves. I hiked for a few hours until I found a perfect clearing to set up my camp. The sun was already setting when I finished, and the sky began to turn orange and purple. I ate something light and sat near my tent to enjoy the tranquility. Everything seemed perfect until silence took over. It wasn't gradual. One moment the forest was full of sounds, and the next everything ceased. No crickets, no birds, no rustling leaves, just an absolute and oppressive silence. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just something natural, but a sense of unease began to grow. While I was packing my things, I heard a twig snap coming from the forest. I turned quickly but saw nothing. Probably an animal, I thought, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the sound came again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and illuminated the area, but the shadows of the trees were so dense that they seemed to hide everything. I decided to get into the tent and try to sleep. but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me alone. I lay there, listening to every little sound outside. That's when I heard something that made me freeze. Footsteps, slow and heavy, circling my tent. My breath quickened, and I held the flashlight like a weapon. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, but this time, it was even more suffocating. I thought about stepping out to take a look, but something inside me urged me not to. Whatever it was there, close, waiting. Hours passed, or at least that's what it felt like. Finally, sleep overcame me, but it didn't last long. I woke up to a strange sound, as if something was scratching the fabric of my tent. My eyes opened wide, and I saw a shadow moving outside. It looked human, but something was wrong with the way it moved, almost awkward, mechanical. My mind screamed for me to stay silent, but my body acted on reflex. I shouted, "Who's there?" The shadow stopped. My heart raced, and silence took over again. Seconds felt like hours until I heard something even worse, a low, hoarse laugh that seemed to come from all directions at once. I didn't know what to do. Staying in the tent felt safe, but at the same time I felt trapped. I decided to step out, armed with the flashlight and a pocket knife. As soon as I unzipped the tent, the cold night air enveloped me. I shone the light around but saw no one. The clearing was deserted, but something didn't feel right. It was as if the forest itself was different, denser, darker. That's when I heard the laughter again, this time coming from the trees to my left. I quickly turned the flashlight in that direction and saw something I will never forget. A tall, thin figure with abnormally long arms and a head that seemed to tilt at an impossible angle. Its eyes glowed, reflecting the light from my flashlight, but they had no life. They were empty like two black holes. My reaction was to run. I left everything behind, tent, backpack, food. Nothing mattered except getting out of there. I ran through the forest, stumbling over branches and rocks, while I heard quick footsteps following me. The sound didn't resemble a human. It was something irregular, as if the creature were running on all fours but still upright. I don't know how, but I managed to find my way back to the car. I got in, locked the doors, and sped away like never before. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw the silhouette standing at the roadside, watching me. It was as if it was letting me go, but with the certainty that this wouldn't end there. Since that day, I have never gone camping again. But sometimes, in the silence of the night, I feel like I'm being watched. And I know that somehow, that thing still follows me. After all, how do you escape something that is not of this world?